Frank Dwyer stirred his coffee in the same corner booth he had claimed every morning for the past 20 years, the Formica table chipped, the vinyl seat cracked and groaning under his weight. The diner smelled like burnt bacon and old coffee, the kind of place time had politely forgotten. Outside, dawn hadn't quite broken yet, and the streetlights still flickered uncertainly over the empty road. Frank glanced at the wall-mounted television near the counter, its volume low, captions rolling across the bottom. The morning news was running a segment on Los Angeles traffic, again. A familiar headline caught his eye: Elon Musk opens new tunnel beneath downtown LA. The screen showed a sleek black Tesla gliding through a neon-lit tunnel like something out of a science fiction film. The Boring Company's latest transportation innovation hopes to eliminate gridlock by sending cars underground through high-speed tunnels, the anchor said, her voice flattened by years of early morning reporting. Frank scoffed under his breath. Sure. Just dig your way out of the mess. He reached for his toast but stopped mid-bite when the young waitress, maybe 19, approached his table. Her name tag read Kayla, and she always smiled too wide, like she was trying to overcompensate for something the world had already taken from her. You ever think we'll be part of something like that? She asked, nodding toward the TV. Frank shook his head, chewing slowly. That's for young people, he muttered, not looking up. Kayla wiped the table next to his and paused. I dunno. I think it's cool. Digging tunnels under a city, changing traffic forever. It's like building a new world. Frank didn't answer. He just stared into his coffee, the brown liquid swirling as if trying to suck him in. Behind his eyes was a weight he didn't talk about, the kind that settles on a man's shoulders when everyone he's loved has either left or stopped calling. He'd turned 68 last month. No party. No calls from his son. Just a generic "happy birthday" card from his bank and a promotional flyer for a hearing aid center in Fresno. Every morning was the same. Wake up at 4 a.m., stretch sore knees, shuffle into the bathroom, wash a face he barely recognized, then drive down the street to the only place still open before sunrise. Routine was comforting, but lately it had started to feel like quicksand. Each day, he sank a little deeper. His back ached more. His phone stayed silent longer. The world outside was changing fast, too fast. And he was stuck in neutral. The news segment shifted to a clip of Elon Musk at a press event. The billionaire inventor was standing in front of a massive tunnel boring machine, his hair messy, shirt untucked, speaking with that strange blend of confidence and awkwardness that made him either deeply inspiring or deeply annoying, depending on who you asked. We're building a future where traffic doesn't dictate your life, Musk said. If something's broken, we build something better. Even if nobody thinks it's possible. Frank's spoon clinked loudly against his cup as he stirred again, harder this time. The words lingered in the air, bouncing off the greasy walls of the diner and into his chest like echoes from a distant life. For a moment, he wasn't 68. He was 35 again, hunched over a drafting table in his garage, pencil smudging blueprints for a smart traffic valve system he believed would revolutionize how California handled its gridlock. It was his dream. His chance. But the patent process was expensive, and then Mary got sick, and then layoffs came, and then he never picked the dream back up again. It had gathered dust in the garage, just like the rest of his life. Kayla brought over a fresh pot of coffee and refilled his cup without asking. She tilted her head. You all right, Frank? He nodded. Just tired. She looked like she wanted to say more but didn't. That was the thing about people in their 20s, they think they know what tired means, but they've never had to bury a wife, lose a job, or look their child in the eye and know he's disappointed in them. When she walked away, Frank pulled a crumpled napkin toward him and scribbled the words that wouldn't leave his head: you can either complain about traffic or start digging. He stared at them for a long time. They weren't just about traffic. Not really. They were about him. About this town. About the way everything around him had slowed down or stopped altogether, while the rest of the world sped forward like one of those Teslas in the tunnel. He thought about his old prototype, still buried under a tarp in his garage. The design was crude by today's standards, a series of modular traffic redirection valves that could be installed beneath highways to alleviate pressure in congested areas. He remembered the day he built it with his son Ryan, who was maybe 10 at the time, all big eyes and dirty hands, asking questions about how the pistons worked and if they could build one for his toy cars. That was the last time they really built anything together. Frank folded the napkin and put it in his jacket pocket. The sun had finally crept above the horizon, throwing pale light across the parking lot. He stood slowly, bones complaining, and dropped a $10 bill on the table. As he stepped outside, he noticed something strange. His heart was beating just a little faster than usual. Not in a medical emergency way, but in a way he hadn't felt in years. Like a tiny engine revving in his chest. He didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like the first step onto a new road. Or maybe a tunnel. As he walked toward his rusted-out pickup, he looked down the empty street, the cracked pavement stretching toward nothing in particular. The kind of road that just ends. But then, he thought, maybe some roads aren't meant to end. Maybe they're just waiting for someone to dig deeper. What if everything he believed about getting old was wrong? What if this wasn't the end? What if it was just the beginning? Somewhere in Los Angeles, cars were flying through underground tunnels, breaking barriers, defying limits. And somewhere in Bakersfield, a man long considered forgotten had just scribbled something on a napkin that might be the blueprint for a whole new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Dwyer used to dream in blueprints. Back in the day, when his hands were steadier and his back didn't protest every time he bent over a drafting table, he could sit for hours sketching out traffic systems, analyzing pressure points in commuter patterns, solving invisible problems with visible lines. That was when he worked for Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, during a time when his name carried some weight in the office and when engineers still used pencils and rulers more than software. He didn't mind the old ways. He liked the feel of things. The quiet rhythm of calculating a curve, the way the lead darkened the grid paper, the way ideas formed slowly, like fog lifting off a freeway at sunrise. He had spent nearly 3 decades with the department, rising from junior analyst to senior design coordinator, working on projects from Redding to San Diego. His proudest work had been a redesign of a notoriously dangerous interchange near Oakland. When it opened, traffic accidents dropped by 63%. He kept that stat framed in his garage. But progress doesn't care about pride. Automation swept in during the late 2000s. A new software suite out of Silicon Valley made traffic modeling nearly instantaneous. One by one, the older guys were offered early retirement packages. Frank held out, resisting the inevitable, until finally a manager half his age told him it was time. They handed him a plaque that said, "Thank you for 29 years of service," and then they took his badge and gave him a folder with instructions on how to access his pension. He was 59 and out of a job. The house had felt colder after that. Mary was still alive then, but her illness had begun to settle in like an unwelcome tenant. Parkinson's, they said. A cruel, creeping thief. She had been the strong one, the sharp one, always reminding him to dream bigger. When they were younger, they used to drive out to watch construction sites together. She liked the smell of fresh asphalt and the strange beauty of a bridge half-built. "It's like a promise," she would say. "Like something's coming." After she passed, 8 years ago this winter, the house turned from quiet to silent. The photos on the mantel gathered dust. Her garden went wild. He tried to keep it trimmed at first, but the roses always bloomed wrong under his care. And their son Ryan had stopped calling around the same time. Frank wasn't sure when the break had fully happened. It was like a hairline crack in pavement, small at first, then spreading until the whole thing buckled. Ryan had always been the ambitious one, all brains and stubborn will. He went to college in Austin, got into software development, and moved to Texas. For years they traded holiday calls and stiff conversations about weather, work, and sports. But something had shifted after Mary died. Frank couldn't talk about grief, and Ryan didn't know how to fill the silence. The last time they spoke, over a year ago, it ended in an argument about Frank selling the house and moving into assisted living. Frank refused, said he still had more to do. Ryan scoffed and said, "You're not building anything anymore, Dad." Frank hung up first. He kept Ryan's number saved but never dialed. And Ryan never called back. So now the house sat in limbo, half museum, half storage locker. The garage was still his sanctuary, though it had become more of a shrine over time. Tools lined the pegboard wall, many unused for years. On the workbench sat a covered lump, his old prototype. Back in the late 90s, during his busiest years at Caltrans, Frank had developed a modular underground valve system that could redirect and absorb traffic flow during peak hours. Think of it like underground gutters for cars. When one road became overloaded, sensors would detect congestion and activate diverters, sending vehicles onto alternative routes in real time. It was smart, adaptive, and 20 years ahead of its time. He called it the transit lung. The idea was to make the road system breathe. He had even written up a proposal for it, built a rough working model using PVC piping, servo motors, and a Raspberry Pi before those were even popular. But the department passed. Too risky, they said. Too ambitious. They wanted safety, not science fiction. Mary had urged him to patent it anyway, but then her symptoms got worse, and Frank spent more time at doctor appointments than in his garage. Eventually, the transit lung was stored under a tarp and forgotten. Until now. After that morning in the diner, after hearing Musk's words, "If something's broken, we build something better," the idea had begun crawling back into his brain like a song he couldn't forget. That night, Frank shuffled into the garage, switched on the ancient overhead bulb, and stood in front of the covered table. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled back the tarp, revealing the prototype. Dust coated every surface. Wires had come loose. The plastic casing was yellowed with age. But the bones were still good. The valves, the logic controller, the basic circuitry, it was all still there, like a time capsule. He pressed the power button out of curiosity. Nothing. Of course not. The battery was dead. But the moment he touched it, something inside him sparked. He had built this. From scratch. With nothing but his hands and his brain and a stack of coffee-stained sketches. And now, a man like Elon Musk was digging tunnels under cities to move cars faster, using some of the same principles Frank had scribbled on legal pads back when CD players were cutting edge. The world had finally caught up to his old idea. Or maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for him to catch up to it. He thought about Ryan again. About the model bridge they had built together when Ryan was 9. Frank had taught him how to glue the toothpicks into triangular trusses, how to balance the load across the beams. Ryan had been so proud when they placed a toy car on it and it didn't collapse. They even painted it blue. Frank had kept that bridge all these years, tucked away in a cabinet in the den. A symbol of something that used to be whole. That night, unable to sleep, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a pad of paper and started sketching again. He didn't know if anyone would care. He didn't even know if it would work. But for the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't regret. He felt curiosity. The next morning, he logged into his old engineering forum. Username, Transit Dwyer. He hadn't posted there in over a decade. The password still worked. He browsed the threads, saw users discussing the new boring company tunnel systems, arguing about safety, capacity, and cost. Frank typed slowly, "I had an idea for underground traffic relief valves in the 90s. Built a prototype in my garage. Wondering if there's anyone here who'd be interested in taking a look." He hovered over the post button. For a second, his heart pounded. Why was he nervous? He wasn't applying for a job. He wasn't asking for money. He was just putting something back into the world. Then he clicked post. He sat there for 10 minutes, waiting. Nothing. 20 minutes. Still nothing. He shut off the computer and went outside to water the weeds where Mary's roses used to grow. The hose leaked. His back hurt. He cursed under his breath. Old man problems. He went back inside to make lunch, then sat down in front of the computer again. One notification. A reply. From a user named neondrive_UCLA. The message read, "This is fascinating. I'm a transportation engineering grad student working on adaptive urban traffic modeling. I've never seen a system like yours. Do you have more details?" Frank stared at the screen. His hand went to his chest, not in pain, but in astonishment. He started typing. He didn't even notice the grin forming on his face. Something had shifted. The world hadn't left him behind. He had just stopped knocking. Until now. Bakersfield hadn't always felt like a ghost in daylight, but lately it seemed like every corner of the town whispered a memory instead of a future. Frank Dwyer drove slowly down Chester Avenue, passing shuttered shops, boarded windows, and faded signs that once promised life, now just reminders of how things used to be. The old movie theater had its marquee half-lit, stuck on a film that came out 3 years ago. The car wash where he used to take his pickup every Sunday was now a vape shop with bars on the windows. Even the gas station played music from another decade, as if refusing to acknowledge anything made after 2005. He turned into the parking lot of the grocery store, one of the last holdouts in the strip mall, and parked next to a rust-colored van that hadn't moved in weeks. The lot was mostly empty, same as it had been for the last 5 years. As he stepped out, his knees gave their usual protest, and he gritted his teeth against the stiffness. Inside the store, the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the beeping of the single open register. There were 2 aisles now instead of 8, and the freezer section had more frost than food. He passed the cereal aisle and ran into Dottie Hensley, his neighbor for almost 30 years. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, wrapped in a coat even though it was 80 outside. "Frank," she said, voice light but strained. "Didn't think I'd see you out today." "Needed milk," he replied, then added, "and a reason to move." She smiled faintly, then looked down at her cart, which held little more than crackers, a bag of oranges, and a single frozen dinner. "I'm selling the house," she said. "Moving in with my daughter in Fresno. She found a nice little place for me near the senior center." Frank nodded slowly. "That right? This town just isn't for us anymore," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Feels like the edges are closing in." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just gave her a soft, "yeah," and they stood in that silence that only 2 people in their 60s or 70s could understand, the kind that comes with recognizing endings before they're announced. Back at home, Frank sat in his garage, staring at the partially uncovered prototype, wondering if maybe Bakersfield's slow death was the real reason he was being pulled back to the project. Maybe this wasn't just about traffic. Maybe it was about legacy. About giving something back before there was nothing left to give. He powered on his laptop and checked the engineering forum. neondrive_UCLA had sent another message. "I showed your design to my advisor. He's blown away. Can we Zoom sometime this week? I'd love to understand more." Frank hesitated. He hadn't used Zoom since Ryan tried to set it up for him during the pandemic. He'd botched it so badly that Ryan told him just to use the phone like always. But the message stirred something in him. He typed, "Yes. I can do Thursday afternoon." The reply came within minutes. "Perfect. Looking forward to it, Mr. Dwyer." That night, while heating up a can of soup, he flipped on the TV, and the news once again featured a segment on Elon Musk's Boring Company. This time, the footage showed a completed tunnel entrance under a nondescript LA street, surrounded by curious onlookers and a few protesters holding signs about environmental disruption. A reporter interviewed a commuter who said the new tunnel had cut her trip from 45 minutes to 10. "It's not just faster," she said, eyes shining. "It makes me feel like I'm living in the future." Frank couldn't remember the last time something made him feel like the future belonged to him. He watched silently, spoon paused mid-air. Then, Elon appeared on screen, speaking to reporters in that same low, analytical tone he always had, part scientist, part dreamer. "People talk about solving traffic with flying cars," Musk said, "but there's space below us that's unused. Why not dig? If something's broken, we don't wait. We innovate." Frank whispered the words to himself, repeating them like a prayer. The next morning, he drove down to the town council hall. The monthly meeting was open to the public, though only a handful of residents ever showed up. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee that had sat too long in the pot. Frank took a seat near the back, wearing his old Caltrans windbreaker. The topic today was a proposal from a private rail company planning to reroute freight lines away from Bakersfield to save costs. "It'll be more efficient," the rail rep said. "Unfortunately, it means fewer stops in this region. But long-term, that's progress." Frank raised his hand. The councilwoman, a former middle school teacher who had once taught Ryan math, nodded toward him. "Mr. Dwyer." He stood slowly. "If you take the trains, if you let the highways dry up, and there's nothing to bring people through, what happens to this town?" The rail rep shrugged. "We're not in charge of town planning, sir. We're in charge of trains." A few people chuckled. Frank's jaw tightened. "Maybe you should care about both." The room fell quiet. He sat back down, pulse drumming in his ears. As he walked out later, a teenager with a skateboard passed him on the steps, earbuds in, oblivious. Frank heard him mutter to a friend, "Why do these boomers even come to this stuff? Like, you're from the dinosaur age, man." The words stung more than he expected. He kept walking, face hard, but inside he felt the same thing he'd felt that morning in the diner, a quiet desperation turning into quiet defiance. At home, he pulled out his design notes from the garage. Pages of hand-drawn schematics, equations, and margin scribbles. He began scanning them into his computer. For hours, he worked like he hadn't in years, forgetting to eat, barely noticing the sun dip below the horizon. It was well past midnight when he uploaded the files to a shared Google Drive and sent the link to neondrive_UCLA. Then he sat in the dark, surrounded by his tools, sketches, and the whir of a space heater. Outside, Bakersfield slept under a blanket of quiet failure. Inside, Frank Dwyer was waking up. This town had been forgotten. Left behind by planners, companies, even its own young people. But maybe that was exactly why it needed someone like him. Someone who still believed in building. Someone who wasn't afraid to dig. The Zoom call started with a blur of ceiling fan blades and the sound of someone adjusting their camera, followed by a brief glimpse of a dorm room with posters of rocket launches and neon tech startups taped to the walls. Then the face of a young man appeared on Frank's laptop screen, maybe early 20s, with sharp eyes and a voice full of energy that reminded Frank of someone he used to know, himself. "Mr. Dwyer, hey. I'm Adam," the kid said, giving an enthusiastic wave. "Thanks so much for agreeing to meet. I've been obsessed with your concept all week." Frank offered a nod, his mouth stiff from disuse. "Just call me Frank. Mr. Dwyer makes me sound like I'm running for office." Adam laughed. "Fair enough. So, your transit lung system, holy crap. The dynamic valve arrays, the way you anticipated congestion points with those predictive models, it's like you built this for the city we have now, not 30 years ago." Frank didn't know what to say. Compliments had become foreign currency to him. But as he watched Adam pull up a diagram from the folder he'd sent, something opened up in his chest. Here was a kid, someone born after Frank had already retired, treating his old blueprints like treasure maps. It was just an idea, Frank muttered. Didn't have the backing. Didn't have the timing. Life got in the way. Adam leaned forward. I think now is the timing. You've seen what Musk is doing with the tunnels, right? What you built, it complements that. You don't need a massive multi-billion-dollar boring machine to make traffic flow better. You just need smarter direction, smarter valves. Your design could work with his tunnel system. It's modular. It's scalable. Frank looked away for a second. The garage was cold, the same bulb overhead buzzing softly. I built that in my garage with scrap and guesswork. It's not exactly elegant. Adam shook his head. Doesn't matter. The theory's sound. Honestly, it's more than sound, it's revolutionary. I showed it to one of my professors, and he said it's the cleanest approach to subterranean traffic redistribution he's ever seen. Like, you shouldn't even be retired. Frank smirked at that, but it faded fast. Retired wasn't the word for what had happened to him. He'd been shelved. Labeled outdated. Like an old paper map in a world of GPS. Adam's voice cut back in, full of enthusiasm. Would you ever consider co-developing this with me? Just, explore a modern implementation. I think if we published a paper on it, or even just built a better working prototype, people would take notice. Frank stared at the screen. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, wrinkled, tired, unsure. But behind that, Adam's hopeful face burned like a spotlight. I'm in, Frank said before he could talk himself out of it. I don't know how much help I'll be with the new tech, but I can show you how it breathes. Adam grinned. That's all I need. After the call ended, Frank didn't move for a while. He just sat there, the hum of the laptop fan filling the silence. It felt strange, like something had shifted, but he couldn't quite put a name to it. He wasn't dreaming, exactly. It was sharper than that. More present. More alive. The next morning, he walked outside to get the mail and caught sight of the neighbor kid, Mikey, skateboarding up and down the cracked sidewalk. The boy was maybe 12, headphones on, practicing kickflips like he was getting paid for it. Frank remembered when Ryan used to do the same thing, minus the music. You build stuff, right? Mikey said without looking up. Frank raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? My mom said you used to work on highways. Said you made something that's gonna fix the traffic, Mikey said as he flipped the board and stumbled. Frank chuckled. Well, I made something. Whether it'll fix anything's still a mystery. Mikey kicked the board back under his feet. Hope it works. My aunt lives in LA and she says it takes her an hour to get across town even when she leaves early. Frank nodded. It's broken all right. Has been for years. Mikey shrugged. You should make something better then. Then he skated off, just like that, as if the solution to one of the biggest problems in the country could be reduced to a line from a sixth grader. You should make something better. That stuck with Frank all day. He repeated it under his breath as he organized old schematics, cleared off the workbench, and started ordering new parts online. A digital valve actuator here, a Raspberry Pi kit there, and a few servo motors for good measure. The UPS driver would probably think he'd lost his mind. He didn't care. That night, Frank dug out one of his old engineering notebooks and flipped to a page dated July 1993. It showed a cross-section of a major California interchange, complete with annotations about choke points and load balancing. He ran his finger along the old ink lines, tracing ideas he once believed would change everything. Maybe they still could. He opened a new sketchbook and started drawing again, but this time with the boring company tunnel system in mind. He imagined his transit lung units embedded at key junctions within the underground networks, using AI-driven signals to divert vehicles dynamically. Instead of clogs, the tunnels would breathe. Expand. Contract. Self-correct. Like a living organism under the surface of the city. He stayed up until 2 a.m. building a 3D model in the open-source CAD software Adam had recommended. His fingers were stiff and his eyes ached, but for the first time in over a decade, Frank Dwyer felt like he was building something that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur. Adam sent code snippets. Frank replied with design tweaks. Together they fine-tuned the sensors. They ran simulations using traffic data pulled from Los Angeles and San Francisco, and every time they ran the numbers, the results came back stronger. Congestion reduced. Commute times slashed. Efficiency up. The system worked. And with the right backing, it could scale. They dubbed the updated version, Transit Lung V2. One night, while scrolling through Elon Musk's X feed, Frank came across a post that stopped him cold. It read, "Don't wait for permission. If the system is broken, build a new one. No hashtags. No fluff. Just that." Frank stared at it for a full minute. The man didn't even know he existed, but somehow he kept saying exactly what Frank needed to hear. He printed the tweet, taped it above his workbench, and stared at it each morning like it was scripture. One morning, Adam messaged with a surprise. "I pitched the concept to my professor. He has a friend in transit policy at the state level. Wants to see the prototype. Thinks we should get media coverage. Are you okay if I send your name and background?" Frank hesitated. He hadn't been in the spotlight since his retirement party, and that had been mostly a room full of forced smiles and cheap cake. "Yeah," he typed slowly. "Let's see what happens." The next week, a journalist from a small but respected tech blog reached out. Wanted to interview the retired engineer reinventing traffic from his garage. Frank almost said no. But then he thought of Dottie, leaving town because no one believed in it anymore. Thought of Mikey, skating on broken sidewalks. Thought of his son, who hadn't called in over a year. Maybe this was more than invention. Maybe this was about relevance. About showing that just because the world moved on didn't mean you had to disappear. He gave the interview. Told them about the old Caltrans days. About Mary. About the prototype. About Adam and the collaboration. He even posed for a photo in the garage, standing next to the prototype with his arms folded and a hesitant grin on his face. When the article went live 3 days later, Frank didn't expect anything. But by noon, it had over 12,000 shares. Adam messaged, Elon retweeted it. With the rocket emoji. Frank stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. He stepped outside, took a deep breath, and looked at the street, same cracked pavement, same faded houses, but something felt different. Maybe it wasn't the street that had changed. Maybe it was him. And for the first time in years, Frank Dwyer felt like the road ahead wasn't just a dead end. It was the beginning of a tunnel. A tunnel with light at the other side. Frank Dwyer had stopped expecting his phone to ring unless it was from a robocall, the pharmacy, or an old friend checking to see if he was still alive. But when it rang that morning, just after sunrise and before he'd poured his first cup of coffee, something about the number on the screen, no name, just a Texas area code, made his heart stutter. He let it ring twice more before answering, bracing for either disappointment or trouble. "Hello." There was a pause. Then a voice he hadn't heard in almost 2 years said, "Hey Dad, it's Ryan." Frank stood there in the middle of his dim kitchen, blinking at the window like he'd forgotten what sunlight looked like. "Ryan," he said, like tasting the name again for the first time. "Is everything okay?" Yeah, Ryan replied quickly, and Frank could hear the shuffle of papers and the clink of a coffee mug on a desk. "I saw the article. The one about you. The garage project." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "Oh," he said, heart caught somewhere between pride and panic. "Didn't think you'd read that kind of thing. Someone forwarded it to me. said, "Hey, isn't this your dad? And, well, I guess I just didn't expect to see you in tech news." Frank chuckled softly, trying to mask the emotion tightening in his throat. "Yeah, me either." "So," Ryan continued, voice lighter now, more cautious, like walking on a frozen lake. "Is it real? Like, are you really working with students again? Doing traffic systems?" Frank leaned against the kitchen counter, staring down at the faded linoleum. "It's real. The prototype still worked. I just needed a reason to plug it back in." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Ryan said, "You always said you were done. After Mom, after the department let you go. I just thought you were done." Frank swallowed. "I thought I was too. But maybe I was just waiting." "For what?" Ryan asked. Frank looked around the room. At Mary's old tea kettle, the stack of engineering notebooks on the table, the photo of him and Ryan building the toothpick bridge so long ago. "For something to pull me back in. For a reason to matter again." The line stayed quiet. Then Ryan said, "You didn't need a reason, Dad. You always mattered. I guess I just didn't know how to say it before." Frank turned away from the window, chest heavy, but not with sadness. "Thanks," he said, voice rough. "That means more than you know." "Listen," Ryan added, "I'd love to hear more about what you're working on. Maybe even help, if you want. I've done a few municipal code integrations for transportation startups out here. I could take a look." Frank blinked. Was this real? "Yeah," he said quickly. "I'd like that. It's not just a solo project anymore. There's a kid from UCLA named Adam helping me modernize the whole thing. And Elon Musk, well, he kind of indirectly lit the fuse on all of this." Ryan laughed, and the sound was like a window opening in a room that hadn't been aired out in years. Of course he did. They spoke for another 10 minutes, more freely than they had in years. And when they hung up, Frank stood still for a long time, the phone pressed against his chest like it might carry an echo of the call. In that moment, he realized something important: the tunnel wasn't just under the city. It was under his life, connecting things he thought had collapsed. His past, his relationships, his sense of purpose. The project was building more than traffic solutions. It was building bridges he thought had crumbled beyond repair. Later that week, Frank and Adam met on Zoom again, this time with a third box on the screen, Ryan's. The three of them brainstormed ideas, mapped out integration points, and argued over data structures like they were in some startup's war room. Ryan brought knowledge of legal codes and city infrastructure that neither Frank nor Adam had. Adam brought modern energy and software talent. And Frank, well, he brought the soul of it, the reason why it mattered in the first place. They formed a strange but powerful trio, and within days, their project had a name: Project Respira. Latin for breathe. They mocked up a site, put together a pitch deck, and submitted it for consideration to a state innovation grant. Frank had never filled out so many online forms in his life. But the process didn't feel like a burden. It felt like ignition. Meanwhile, emails began trickling in from people across the country who had read the article or seen Elon's retweet. Retired engineers. Urban planners. Teachers. Even a high school robotics team from Ohio asking if they could try to replicate Frank's original prototype for their year-end project. "This hit me hard," one email read. "I'm 67, used to design railway switches in Chicago. Thought no one cared about what we did anymore. But your story gave me a reason to go back to my old notebooks. Thank you." Another simply said, "Your prototype reminded me of my father. He passed away last year. He always talked about fixing the freeway system. You've made his dream feel alive again." Frank read every message, sometimes twice, and printed the ones that made him feel something deep and unfamiliar: a swelling in his chest, a crack in the cold shell that had grown around his heart. He tacked them to the corkboard in his garage, right under the tweet from Musk, until the board was full and he had to start pinning to the wall. This wasn't just about traffic anymore. It wasn't even just about proving himself. This was about showing a generation, his generation, that it wasn't over. That age didn't mean irrelevance. That you could still build, still matter, still shake the dust off your dreams no matter how long they'd sat dormant. And then came the call from the State Transportation Board. Frank almost didn't pick up. It was late. He was tired. But something told him to answer. A woman with a calm voice introduced herself as the Deputy Director of Innovation Grants. "Mr. Dwyer," she said, "your proposal for Project Respira. It's been selected for review by our fast-track urban implementation team. We're intrigued by the possibilities, especially as a complement to existing tunnel projects in the region." Frank's knees nearly gave out. He grabbed a chair and sat down hard. "You're serious?" "We are," she said. "And if your team is willing to present in Sacramento next month, we'd like to move forward with a feasibility study." After he hung up, Frank didn't move. The hum of the garage filled the air. Outside, Bakersfield slept. But inside, Frank Dwyer felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: urgency. Purpose. A future pulling him forward. He grabbed his sketchbook and began jotting notes for the presentation. And as he worked, he whispered quietly to himself, not in disbelief, but in awe. It's happening. For the first time in decades, the dream was no longer buried. It was surfacing, rising up like a tunnel breaking through to daylight. Sacramento in late October was surprisingly warm, the sky a crisp blue with only a few wisps of white clouds drifting above the Capitol building. Frank stood in front of the State Transportation Center, his tie slightly crooked, the collar of his dress shirt chafing his neck in a way he hadn't felt in years. He hadn't worn a suit since Mary's funeral. Adam stood beside him, adjusting his laptop bag, dressed like a Silicon Valley startup rep with a sport coat over sneakers and an energy that Frank admired and occasionally envied. Ryan had flown in from Texas the night before, and now stood on Frank's other side, sleeves rolled up, coffee in hand, cool and composed the way his mother used to be during PTA meetings or school recitals. Together, they looked like a strange team, like a lineup from a time travel movie, past, present, and future, all converging for one unlikely pitch. "They're not expecting much," Adam said quietly as they walked toward the security checkpoint. "Most of these grant review boards don't take unsolicited pitches seriously." Frank gave a small grunt. "Let's make them regret that." Inside, the boardroom was clean and cold, with large windows overlooking a courtyard and a long oak table at the center. 11 committee members sat at the far end, murmuring to each other, scrolling tablets, flipping through printed packets. None of them looked up when Frank's name was called. Mr. Dwyer, and Mr. Walker," the woman in the center said, barely glancing at them. 15 minutes. Begin when ready." Frank stepped forward, hands slightly trembling as he clicked the small remote and brought the first slide to life on the screen. It was a simple animation, a pulse of light traveling through a congested tunnel, slowing, then stopping. Then another light, a new path forming, flowing around the clog. Simple. Visual. Breathe in. Breathe out. "Traffic is killing American cities," Frank said, voice steadier than he expected. "Not just in hours wasted, but in how it makes people feel, stuck, helpless, invisible. My name is Frank Dwyer. I spent 40 years building California's freeway systems. I was there when we widened lanes, added metering lights, restriped interchanges, hoping it would fix things. It didn't." He clicked again. More data, more images. Adam stepped in, talking about dynamic pressure valves, automated lane redirection, the integration of AI learning to adapt tunnel traffic in real time. Then Ryan took over, presenting the legal model, policy overlays, and how Project Respira could be adopted into Elon Musk's existing tunnel network as a living add-on, not a competing system. We're not replacing Musk's tunnels, Ryan said. We're helping them breathe. Frank stepped back in. I built the first prototype in my garage 30 years ago. And thanks to this team, he gestured at Adam and Ryan, we've made it smarter, smaller, and more powerful. It's not a pipe dream. It's ready. Silence followed. Not a nod. Not a smile. Just 11 blank faces staring back like statues. The woman in the center cleared her throat. Thank you for your presentation. We'll deliberate and follow up. That was it. No questions. No feedback. Just a dismissal. Back outside, Frank ripped off the tie and shoved it in his pocket. Well, he muttered, that was a waste of dry cleaning. Adam sighed. They weren't listening. They weren't even awake, Ryan added. This is the problem with entrenched systems. If it's not coming from a consultant with $1 million firm behind it, they assume it's fantasy. Maybe it is, Frank said, surprising himself. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and dusty from Bakersfield sidewalks. Maybe this was always too big. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Not deep down. Not where the spark lived. Adam checked his phone and lit up. Wait. Hold on. Musk's chief tunnel engineer just followed me on X. And they'd met. They saw the presentation slides through a leak from one of the interns on the review board. What? Frank asked. What does that mean? It means, Adam said slowly, his eyes wide, we just got someone's attention who actually builds tunnels. That night, back in the hotel, Frank sat on the edge of the bed, remote in hand, flipping channels like the static might offer comfort. Then a text from Adam, Zoom link. Musk team. Midnight. Frank stood up so fast he nearly tripped over his suitcase. Midnight came quickly. The screen lit up. 3 faces joined, 2 engineers from the Boring Company and 1 project director named Layla who introduced herself as Elon's bluntest strategist. She spoke fast, sharp, no time wasted. We reviewed your model. The dynamic lung structure, very clever. No one's approached it from that angle before. Elon's intrigued. He wants us to test integration viability. Frank blinked. So what are you saying? Layla leaned forward. I'm saying. Your team just became real. You've got 6 weeks. Build a deployable module. Prove it works underground. If it does, we plug it into Phase 3 of the Vegas loop expansion. Frank couldn't speak. His hands trembled as he reached for a pen that wasn't there. Adam jumped in. We'll need access to your current tunnel spec sheets. We've got the prototype in Bakersfield, but it's still garage grade. We'll send you specs, load tests, data streams, Layla replied. This is how it works in our world, fast, messy, disruptive. If that's too much, walk now. No shame in it. Frank finally found his voice. We don't walk. Good, she said. Then don't stop. The screen went dark. The call ended. Frank sat there, laptop glowing on his knees. He looked across the hotel room at Ryan, who joined the call silently from the couch. This just got real, Frank said. Yeah, Ryan replied, and you didn't even flinch. Over the next few weeks, Frank worked harder than he had in decades. The garage transformed into a lab. Spare parts everywhere. Code running on 3 laptops. Adam arrived in person, crashing on the couch, powering through long days and longer nights. Ryan flew in every other weekend, tightening the legal and compliance frame. Frank barely slept. He didn't care. This was the kind of tired that meant something. This was the fatigue that comes from meaning, from momentum, from mission. Mikey, the neighbor kid, wandered over one afternoon, skateboard tucked under his arm. Is that the thing that's gonna fix traffic? He asked, peering into the garage. It's a part of it, Frank said, not looking up. Cool, Mikey said. My mom said you were in the news again. Frank stopped and looked at him. You think old people can still fix stuff? Mikey shrugged. If you made it, yeah. Old people built everything. That night, Frank sat at the workbench long after Adam had passed out and Ryan had gone back to his hotel. He turned the prototype over in his hands, watching the servo motors twitch as they responded to test data. This thing was alive. It breathed. Not just air, not just data. Hope. A few days before the scheduled test, Frank got an email from the Boring Company's site director. Tunnel access confirmed. Week 1 slot granted. Be ready. Adam looked at him, eyes wide. We're going to Vegas. Frank smiled, the weight of years lifting with every beat of his heart. We're not going to Vegas, he said. We're going into the future. Everything changed the moment Frank pressed send on that Zoom link invite to neondrive_UCLA. It was an invitation into his world, into the dusty garage that had become the birthplace of his legacy and, now, his revival. 2 days later, his laptop dinged and the meeting filled with bright energy. Adam's face, no longer youthful and hesitant but energized, lit up every pixel. The university's engineering advisor, Dr. Vargas, hovered next to him, serious and analytical, observing the age-wrinkled hands hovering over Frank's CAD files. Ryan leaned closer from his side of the split screen, adjusting the prototype blueprint with agile fingers. Theirs was a mix of disparate generations wired together by a shared pulse, a shared spark of something larger than a single person or a dusty idea. This, Dr. Vargas began, voice clipped with both critique and admiration, this is elegant. The way the valves react to real-time congestion input, adaptive, not just reactive. You built intuition into the design. Adam nodded eagerly. Exactly. It doesn't just distribute pressure. It anticipates, reroutes, breathes. Frank watched them grapple with technical terms that sounded like poetry. PID loops, load balancing, fail-safe actuators, words he used to craft into equations decades ago. Now they floored him from the other side of a Zoom call. By the end of the hour, they had agreed on one small change: they would convert the analog sensor triggers to digital inputs, tied through Raspberry Pi modules running custom-coded logic. It was a tweak, but it would allow the prototype to interface seamlessly with modern tunnel control systems. Frank scribbled notes, heart thumping like the piston of a buried engine firing to life. That night, he didn't sleep. He rewrote circuit diagrams, soldered new sensors onto the pressure plates, replaced old resistors with fresh microchips. When morning came, his joints ached, but his spirit felt younger than it had in years. That afternoon, they performed the first digital simulation, a congested tunnel flooded with cars, represented by glowing dots slowing in queues, pressure building. And then, his valves opened. Streams of light redirected the flow. The blockage dissolved. The tunnel breathed again. Frank exhaled, sweat pooling on his brow. Ryan, watching the same animation on his screen, punched the air. That's it, he whispered. That's working. A small change, but enormous. It meant the system could respond. It meant the transit lung could plug into anything, from small underground corridors to Musk's Grand Vegas loop network. They called it adaptive breathing, and it was ridiculously graceful. Within days, another email pinged in, the Boring Company's midnight engineers Slack. Layla's terse message: send us the new model and logic logs. We may run an in-tunnel simulation next week. Frank reread it 5 times, the words sealing themselves in his chest. He spent the next 2 nights packing the prototype carefully, wrapping it in foam, shipping it to Las Vegas with precise instructions about how to power it, where to run diagnostics, which logs to record. He felt like he was sending a child to college. The module arrived just before the week ended. The Boring Company's midnight team, young, sleeveless tattoos and caffeinated energy, unveiled the arrival on their screens. One of them held the model up to a webcam in a fluorescent-lit workshop. Frank watched from Bakersfield, chest tight. They ran the test underground. Real tunnel, real pressure sensors, the system folded into it like it had belonged there the whole time. The valves opened, diverted, adjusted. Congestion dropped by measurable percentages. The screen showed real data, throughput increased, bottlenecks dissolved, time loss plummeted. It worked. Maybe too well. Next morning, Adam called. "They want you in Vegas. Come run it in situ next week." Frank felt dizzy, but he nodded. He'd built his life in this garage, but now he'd run it in a tunnel under Las Vegas. He had a reason to move again. The rest of the week he prepared, boarding passes, approvals, packing engineering tools like they were weapons of purpose. On the flight south, bathed in sunrise, he stared at the page of his flight itinerary, Las Vegas, bold and improbable. In the terminal, he navigated security with the jitter of nerves that come from stepping into something real. Emerging on the other side, he found himself surrounded by energy, buzzing crowds, lights, desert heat, possibility. A boring company rep, suit slightly rumpled, full of apologies and pride, escorted him to a subterranean elevator that whisked him deeper under Vegas than he had ever imagined. The tunnel breathed warmth and echo. Strip lights bled through cracks in the concrete. Tesla Model Ys zipped past. Cameras monitored every inch. He tucked in his prototype, flipping on its own sensors. The engineer gave a thumbs up, flicked a switch, and the tunnel lit up with data lines. Frank watched monitors light up with graphs that pulsed across the wall, flow rates, timing, sensor readings rising and settling. The adaptive valves responded. Pressure dropped. Flow stabilized. For a moment, he let disbelief unravel behind his eyes. Then a rumble through the tunnel, cars gliding, no halt, smooth glide. Data confirmed it, throughput up by 15%. Bottleneck freed. The tunnel had breathed. Later, standing next to Elon's team at the test site, Frank realized the small change had become seismic. He thought of Bakersfield, the diners, the dusty garage, the kids skateboarding past, Marwai's garden gone wild. All that weight, that past, reflected back through a tunnel lit with movement and possibility. Layla leaned close, voice low. "You built more than a valve system. You built a future." Frank's chest felt full, old, worn, aching, but full. "We dug," he whispered. "We breathed." And he realized, with a weight turned feather light, that this was more than about traffic. This was about proving that age, time, disuse, years bent like arches, they didn't have to mean failure. They could mean depth. And the deeper you dug, the more you surfaced into somewhere new. He wasn't alone anymore, he was part of something living, adaptive, unstoppable. And it had begun with one small change. Frank Dwyer woke before dawn, a thin shaft of light slipping through the dusty garage window, illuminating blueprints, tools, and the prototype at the center of it all. The previous week in Las Vegas had delivered more than validation, it had cracked open a doorway to possibility, and he felt himself walking through it, even in half-sleep. He shook off the grogginess, grabbed his thermos of strong coffee, and turned on the overhead bulb. Beneath its yellow glow, the garage looked the same, but everything had changed. This wasn't just his old workspace. It was the nerve center of Project Respira, and now, with the backing of the Boring Company, it was about to become an innovation hub, and community beacon. He opened his laptop, Adam had already sent new schematics, and Ryan had updated the legal framework for cross-jurisdictional prototype testing. Frank's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant for a heartbeat, then dove into revisions. Old hands, pressing new keys. It hit him, technology evolves, but craftsmanship never dies. By mid-morning, Frank's neighbor and fellow tinkerer, Marvin Jenkins, shuffled into the garage. Marvin had spent 30 years fixing farm equipment and classic trucks. His hands were thick from grease and welding torches, but his eyes carried curiosity that outmatched anyone's. "Got another one of Elon's gadgets?" Marvin asked, nodding at the corner where the new circuit board glowed under its breadboard lights. "You're still chasing that dream?" Frank chuckled, adjusted a resistor, and said, "Yeah. We're building smart breathing valves for tunnels." Marvin stared. "You hear that, kids? Old Frank's building tunnel lungs." Marvin's laughter echoed across the concrete floor. It was a shared joke now, but a proud one. He lit up that day the same way Adam's Zoom face had lit up the first time they went over the design. They worked side by side for hours, Marvin placing components, Frank wiring sensors, each of them moving in a rhythm that felt both ancient and urgently alive. By afternoon, they booted up a local simulation, tunnel congestion input, smart valves adjusting, data pulsing in graphs on the screen. The numbers were cleaner. The flow was smoother. It ran like a heartbeat. That evening, Frank received a message from Adam: "We've scheduled a video demo next week with the Boring Company's integration team. Let's loop in Marvin, too, his craft is part of the story." Frank looked at Marvin, hunched over a soldering iron, sparks drifting like fireflies, and realized, this wasn't just innovation. It was reclamation, of purpose, of respect, of identity. Older hands, building the future. Days passed in a blur. Adam flew in on the weekend. He and Marvin talked shop, relays, improvement requests, firmware integrations, while Frank leaned back, watching the generational bridge form. He thought about Ryan, out there in Texas, helping them navigate municipal policy. He realized how precious this triangle of effort was, past, present, and future converging in one dusty garage, building something real. The demo day arrived. The garage was quiet when Frank led the video meeting with the Boring Company's integration engineers. They walked the team through the modular transit lung unit, now upgraded with Marvin-built braces and Adam's digital logic board. Sensors glowed, valves reacted dynamically, data streamed into the screen in real time. In the corner of the garage, taped to the wall, that Elon tweet stayed right above the board: "Don't wait for permission." It felt like a benediction. The Boring team nodded. They asked questions, perfect questions, about fail-safes, temperature variances, emergency shut-off protocols. Frank answered each one carefully, his voice steady, authoritative. When they signed off, they said simply, "This works. We're scheduling a pilot in LA." Frank exhaled, his chest heavy with relief, pride, and awe. That night, Marvin slapped him on the shoulder. "Kid, you built a damn lung for a tunnel, and it works." Frank laughed. "We did it." "All of us," Marvin corrected him. Outside, the street lamp flickered as Frank closed up. He walked home under starlight, the town quiet, but inside him, the engine revved again. So you see, it wasn't just technology or tunnels or traffic. It was human connection. A cracked garage became a laboratory. Old friends, new collaborators, a son rebuilding a bridge, these were the pillars. Whatever happened next, Frank knew one thing: the road wasn't over. It was just going deeper. Everything changed for Frank Dwyer the moment he heard a knock on the garage door, an unexpected, formal knock, not the usual soft tap from Marvin or the freight of the UPS guy. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to find a reporter standing there, clipboard in hand and a curious expression beneath her press badge. Her name was Emily, and she said she wrote for a tech innovation blog that covered the outsiders, the forgotten engineers, and wanted to tell his story. Frank hesitated. He hadn't invited the spotlight. He'd just been tinkering. But when she mentioned Elon's tweet and how Frank's Transit Lung V2 prototype had lit something in people like him, something Frank hadn't thought about, hope, he felt a shift. Inside, his heart flickered with the old spark Mary used to light in him when she admired his work. He agreed to let her in, telling her to step carefully among the tools and sketches and half-finished circuit boards. She took photos of his hands on wires, his eyes reflecting design diagrams, and asked questions like, "How does it feel to be part of something bigger again?" Frank's voice cracked when he talked about Mary, about Ryan, about the little overpass model he and his son built together decades ago. Emily nodded, her eyes soft. She finished with, "I'll make sure they see your truth." That sold it for Frank, truth. The story went live 2 days later. Retired engineer breathes life into traffic solution with Elon-approved prototype. It went viral before lunch. Comments from around the world trickled in, retirees, engineers, dreamers. "This gives me courage," one post read. "If he can still build, maybe I can still build, too." Frank stared at the screen, astonished. Then another ping, a retweet from Elon's official account. Not a quote, just Frank's image in his dusty garage under a single bulb, and the caption, "Innovators never retire." That retweet broke something open. The garage door burst with activity. Local officials called, asking if they could see the prototype. Bakersfield's minor league newspaper wanted to run a feature. Even a retired colleague sent a message, "Never forgot about your transit lung." Frank realized the quiet isolation he'd felt for years, the sense that the world had moved on without him, had cracked. News crews filmed him talking to his old tools like friends. He felt raw but alive. Through it all came another knock, this one more tentative. It was Ryan, standing on the porch at dusk, holding a small toolbox and something Jeremy Lin might consider old-school confidence. The look in his eyes wasn't judgment this time. It was curious, gentle. "Mind if I come in?" Ryan asked. And Frank nodded. That night, they stayed late in the garage, soldering and laughing, patching up protocols, making the Transit Lung V2 feel like family again. Then lightning in the form of another email, from the Boring Company's midnight engineer team, they wanted in-person collaboration. They'd offered a space in their lab, access to testing protocols, real-world tunnel simulations. "Let's get to work," they wrote. Frank looked at Adam and Ryan. No words, just a nod. They, this trio of past, present, and future, rounded a corner together. Frank realized the garage was shrinking as possibility expanded. Bakersfield streets might still be cracked, the diner still half-forgotten, but now there was a bridge being built under it all, a tunnel of innovation, human reconnection, and stubborn hope. And as the moon slipped into the sky that night, Frank understood that the knock on the door wasn't just for a story, it was for everything that followed, everything he refused to stop building. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The Boring Company's invitation arrived like a gust of desert wind, unexpected, exhilarating, and a little intimidating. Frank sat at his cluttered kitchen table, the letter crisp in his hands, the logo unmistakable. They were offering a chance to work on the actual Vegas loop infrastructure, an opportunity no engineer, no matter their age, should ignore. But Frank's mind spun with doubts. At 67, with creaky knees and decades of retirement behind him, was this real? Could he really walk into that cavernous, humming world underground and hold his own among the young engineers with their digital tablets and rapid-fire jargon? That evening, the walls of his Bakersfield home felt tight, the quiet hum of the night suddenly oppressive. He stared at the letter again and again, then clicked open a podcast he'd been following, Elon Musk, candid, relentless, talking about breaking boundaries, defying limits, and the endless potential in people who refuse to accept too late. Elon's voice filled the room. If you're not trying to make the future better, you're just waiting for the end. Age is a number, not a sentence. Frank felt a swell inside him, a flame flickering against the shadows of doubt. The next morning, he called the Boring Company. "I'm in," he said, voice steady but tinged with the weight of years. The trip to Las Vegas was a blur of sunlight and noise, but underground, the air shifted, cool, dense, alive with electricity and possibility. Frank stepped onto the platform that led into the loop, Tesla cars zipping past, lights reflecting on smooth concrete walls like stars in a dark sky. The young engineers greeted him with open curiosity, their initial skepticism fading as Frank talked through the transit lung's design with precision and passion. He noticed the blend of admiration and surprise in their eyes. Days turned into nights as Frank immersed himself in testing, tweaking valve settings, calibrating sensors, and watching live congestion maps ripple across the control room screens. Every success was a surge of energy, every setback a challenge to be solved. His hands, though wrinkled, were steady, crafting connections, updating software with help from Adam and Ryan who had flown in to assist remotely. One evening, as the test tunnel emptied faster than ever before, Frank leaned against a wall and thought about the long road behind him, the early mornings in that Bakersfield garage, the long-ago dreams, the lost time with Mary and Ryan, the regret that had threatened to bury him. But down here, in this mechanical artery beneath the neon lights, he found a new rhythm. The tunnel's pulse matched his own. He was not done. The team began calling him, the Old Lung, a badge of honor that brought a smile to Frank's lips. In the glow of computer monitors, he shared stories with Layla and the Midnight Engineers, how he'd built radios as a boy, how his dreams had always been bigger than the space around him. They listened, fascinated. One night, Elon Musk himself dropped by the lab unannounced, arriving like a force of nature, his presence magnetic and unapologetic. Frank's heart hammered as Elon examined the transit lung, asked questions about the valve responsiveness and failsafes. When Elon nodded and said, "This could be scaled anywhere," Frank felt something crack open inside, a validation that went beyond technology. It was a message for every person who'd ever felt sidelined by age or circumstance: you still matter. On the flight home, Frank looked out over the desert as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The world was shifting beneath his feet, and he was part of the movement. The transit lung was no longer just a prototype, it was a symbol of resilience, of reinvention, and of the power of one small idea to breathe new life into a tired, clogged world. He was ready for the next challenge. The tunnel wasn't just a passage through Earth, it was a passage through time, from fading to flourishing, from quiet despair to roaring hope. And Frank Dwyer was breathing again. Frank Dwyer's return home from Las Vegas felt triumphant, his bones ached, yes, and his voice was hoarse from excitement and long hours underground, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. Before even unpacking his tools, he booted up his laptop to catch up on email and news. The first message that grabbed him was from Ryan: "You did it. Mom would be proud. We did it." That line alone might have been enough to make Frank pause for a moment, remembering Mary's smile, her belief in him when no one else did. He typed back, "We're just getting started," and shut the laptop with a grin. Then came a flood. Not all messages were supportive. Some local council members wrote to question the safety of integrating a homegrown valve system into an underground transit network. One said, "This scheme sounds dangerous." A few anonymous social media posts mocked him, calling him "delusional retiree plays tunnel plumber." A handful on Twitter accused him of trying to ride Elon's coattails for attention. That sting, for someone who'd just been given a second act, curled in his chest. He stared at the screen, took a slow breath, and opened a message from Adam: "We've got to face criticism. The important thing, tunnel test data is airtight. Let's keep moving forward." Frank sat back in his chair and thought of Bakersfield, the boarded-up cafes, the sidewalks that cracked like old skin, the diner where he once felt invisible. He'd come back into the world, but clearly not everyone was ready to welcome someone like him who dared to dream after 60. Frank closed his eyes and let fatigue and frustration settle in for a heartbeat. Then he opened them, steadier. He tapped out a message to the local council members. Polite, factual, citing test results, safety protocols, redundancy systems. He offered to present at the next town hall. He sent drafts to Ryan and Adam, who provided edits. They were building more than a system, they were building trust. The next day at the garage, Marvin appeared, one steady presence among the swirling doubt. He leaned in, inspecting the valve assembly and said, "They just don't see the heart behind it." Frank nodded, eyes tired. "Sometimes they never do until you prove it." Meanwhile, the Boring Company team had followed up, scheduling a public demonstration at a local university's engineering expo. Frank, with Adam and Ryan, prepared a presentation that merged data and storytelling, human connection and airflow charts, concrete tests and heartfelt narrative. They built a life-size mock tunnel valve station in the expo hall and programmed live digital feedback showing how congestion in a virtual tunnel resolved itself when the transit lung engaged. On the day of the expo, Frank stood behind the exhibit, his hands trembling very slightly. When the first university student shyly approached, asked how old he was, and nodded when Frank said 68, eyes alight with admiration, the weight vanished. Young engineers asked questions, professors took notes, television crews filmed him explaining system functionality with pinpoint clarity. Midway through, a man in a suit stepped into the exhibit, Mayor Jameson of Bakersfield. Not known for flashy appearances, he looked skeptical until Frank pulled up the test graphs and tunnel maps. The mayor's jaw softened. After the crowd cleared, he shook Frank's hand. "We see you now." That phrase echoed in Frank's mind as he left the expo. Not everyone delighted in his comeback, but proof changed minds. In the days that followed, he became a de facto spokesperson for aging innovators, invited to speak on a televised panel about transportation futures, alongside young startup founders. He took a deep breath before stepping on stage in front of bright lights and cameras. His introduction noted his years out of the field, and then he spoke about being underestimated for age, about forgotten towns like Bakersfield, about designing solutions not just for systems, but for people. He ended by saying, "Innovation doesn't retire. It just gets quieter." But quiet doesn't mean gone. Applause rippled through the audience, and Frank found Ryan's proud face in the crowd. That night, emails arrived, invitations from engineering clubs, local groups, and seniors who wrote, "At 70, I might just have a purpose again." Frank smiled and thought, this journey wasn't just fixing tunnels, it was breathing life into hope. Built into every valve, every line of code, every lecture, was the belief that you're never too old to matter. And as his phone glowed through the night, lit by messages of support and curiosity and even criticism, Frank Dwyer felt one clear truth pulse through it all: the tunnel he dug wasn't just underground. It was underneath our hearts, reconnecting people to their own potential, no matter the age. Frank's world narrowed to two things: the roar of the tunnel tests on monitors and the weight in his chest that would not settle. The weeks following the expo, the validation from peers and press, the steady hum of progress, it had felt combustible, like every part of him was fuel. But even fuel can catch fire if not tended, and late one night in the garage his body finally gave in. His vision blurred, his knees buckled, and the world went gray. He woke up in a hospital room, the walls white, the smell antiseptic, and the sound of machines counting his heartbeat like an accusation. A nurse stood by the door. "You had a collapse," she told him gently. "You need rest." Frank pressed his hand to his chest, felt the residual tremor of his heart, not from fear, but from shock. The doctor arrived next, polite, professional. "You pushed yourself too hard," she said, checking his blood pressure. "We're sending you home with orders, no heavy work for at least 2 weeks." Frank stared at her, words lodged in his throat like unfinished sentences. 2 weeks. That felt like a sentence, not a reprieve. The project, the tests, the promise, he'd never felt closer to breathing again. And here it was, slipping away. Back at home, he lay in bed, the garage silent behind him, the tools untouched. His phone dinged, Adam, Ryan, the midnight team, sending updates, asking when he'd be back. He looked at the screen, wanted to answer, wanted to say that he'd be fine soon. But his body whispered another truth: slow down. The cell on the screen glowed in the dark room, but his spirit throbbed in tandem with an old sense. Maybe this was the real test, not engineering, not advocacy, but endurance. A flash of a memory, Mary, 2 days before she died, telling him to take care of himself, not just build for others. He closed his eyes and thought of the diner, the garage, the tunnel breathing underneath Las Vegas. He thought of Ryan, who had called in the oasis of reconnection. He thought of Marvin, silent and steady. He thought of the kid on the sidewalk saying old people built everything. And he thought of all the emails from people, retired, broken, afraid, saying your story gave them reason. The ache deepened between his ribs, not physical, but real. He whispered into the silence, I'm scared. A few days later, the nurse called to check in. She asked how he was. He said, truthfully, not good. You're doing what matters, she said. Let your body catch up. That night, between the throb of pain and the hum of the 4, Frank scrolled through messages. One caught his breath, a note from Barbara Biskind, the inventor and designer who joined IDEO at age 89, saying, I design with empathy. Age doesn't preclude creation. Her example felt like light through the cracks. He reached for his sketchbook, shaky hands tracing the transit lungs curves, even though he couldn't hold a wrench right now. He sketched anyway, blue lines, red valves, heartbeats. In the gloom, he realized something: progress wasn't always momentum. Sometimes it was patience. Innovation wasn't always pushing forward, it was learning when to pause and heal, so that when you returned, you weren't just rebuilding systems, you were rebuilding yourself. Weeks passed in quiet introspection. He couldn't do the long hours. He couldn't stand for demos. He couldn't ignore the ache that had lit off his chest. But he could plan. He wrote an email to the boring company, I had a medical setback. Awaiting clearance. Full support for the team remotely. Ready to return when healed. He messaged Ryan and Marvin, slow road ahead. But still breathing. He asked Adam to get them through the next simulation phase, to hold things tight. They replied with words Frank saved, tethering him to the movement he'd sparked. Then came another surprise, an invite to speak at a virtual summit for older creators and innovators. The host told him they knew he was recovering and said, we'd like you to talk about resilience, adaptation, and hope, not traffic, but how to keep dreaming when the body balks. Frank thought of his garage and the tunnel, and he typed back, I'll talk. The morning of the summit, Frank propped himself in the hospital bed, the window pale with sunrise. His face was pale, his voice softer. He logged in. Faces appeared, gray-haired inventors, past their prime artists, seasoned dreamers. They nodded with recognition in their eyes. He began quietly. He spoke of Mary and Marvin and Ryan. He spoke of the prototype and the tunnel and the failure that wasn't failure. He spoke of pain, of breakdown, of the imperative to breathe again, even when you can't. He quoted Elon Musk, if something is important enough, you should try, even if the odds aren't in your favor. Then he shared Barbara's story, creating at 90, designing with older eyes. The room warmed. People thanked him. They said he gave them permission. That night, alone in recovery, Frank looked at the tunnel sketches taped to the wall. From the outside it looked like a diagram, but he saw something else, a lifeline. He smiled, not because it was done, but because he'd learned something vital. Sometimes the break you fear is the break you need to rebuild stronger. And when he finally stood, months later, strengthened and careful, the tunnel would be waiting. Engines humming, valves breathing, ready to carry life forward, not just through cities, but through human hearts. That was the true legacy he was building. Frank Dwyer awoke that morning with a dull ache in his chest, a remnant of the collapse that had reminded him how fragile ambition could be. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, fingers tracing cobweb cracks he'd once ignored. The garage sat silent behind him, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the urge to rush down and tinker. That silence carried a kind of brightness, like the breath after you hold it too long. His phone blinked with a message, from Ryan. He hesitated, thumb hovering, then opened it. The words read, "Saw what you built. I'm proud. Want to talk?" Frank paused. He hadn't heard "I'm proud" in years. Not since Mary gave him that look when he unveiled his first design. He pressed call. The line rang, his heart pounding like a piston firing to life. "Dad?" Ryan's voice came across, gentle and cautious. "I saw the article on the expo. The mayor's words, when they said, 'We see you now.' That was you." Frank let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I'm still not sure if I belong." Ryan's voice was quiet, stronger than he felt. "You belong," he said. "More than ever." That was the bridge they'd been building. He sank back onto pillows. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Call me in when you can." They talked for hours, about data, about valves, about policy, but mostly they talked about them, about the years lost, about how that garage still smelled like possibility. Frank Loro, and Ryan did too. When they hung up, dawn was breaking, beams of sunlight crawled across the room, and Frank felt, for the first time in years, like he belonged to something that mattered. A few days later, his doctor finally cleared him for light activity. Not in a trench coat, gritty heel way, but in a breath-still-comes-painlessly way. He walked to the garage, tools inert on the bench. He traced his eyes across sketches taped to the wall, algorithms, schematics, conference dates. Then he went to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat at the table writing a note to the team, feeling better. "Ready when we are." He took another sip. Outside, the house exhaled into the morning light, and so did he. That afternoon, a Zoom ping from Adam lit up the screen. He entered, bright-eyed. "Site Control wants to meet," he said. "Phoenix is offering a tunnel test. They're interested in deploying the transit lung there as an extension to their downtown underground loop. They say you're invited to present." Frank's heart throbbed. Phoenix. Another city. Another chance. He stared at the screen, caught between glory and fear. He thought of Elon's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." He whispered them, and the fear folded into urgency. "Let's do it," he said. For weeks, the trio worked on the Phoenix proposal. They reconfigured the modular unit for extreme heat, added remote diagnostic tools, and built a narrative that tied the tunnel project back to Bakersfield, how an aging engineer in a forgotten town had lit a spark of innovation that spread like cracks in concrete. During a late-night call, Ryan said, "They'll listen if you make them feel the story, the ache behind it." Frank nodded through the screen. "That's why they called him, the Heart." Amelia from the Boring Company said quietly, "We see you." The day of the Phoenix Zoom presentation arrived, and Frank sat in the garage-turned studio, surrounded by tools and sketches. He sang out the opening of his talk with a soft power. He spoke about loneliness and loss, about being retired and forgotten, then how a tunnel sparked something that refused to die. He wove in Elon's line again, softly and without fanfare, "It's normal to feel fear. But when something is important enough, you do it anyway." He watched faces on the screen, transport officials, civic planners, engineers. When the presentation ended, there was silence. Then applause. Requests for details, follow-ups, pilots. They said they felt something. They said they believed. Frank closed his eyes. Everything felt fragile and beautiful. The aging hands on the tools, the quiet Dallas porch where he hadn't felt heard, the tunnel under Las Vegas, the small hospital bed where he nearly quit, these all wove into a bigger tapestry. A week later, the message came, Phoenix had approved a small-scale pilot. Frank's design would be deployed. He allowed himself to smile from the inside out. He thought about Dottie leaving town, about kids skating past his garage, about Mary planting roses the wrong way but with love. None of that was erased. Instead, it became roots. He put down the phone, walked outside, the warm breeze soft against his face. He whispered into the quiet street, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The day Ryan arrived in Bakersfield felt like the turning point of time. He carried a worn suitcase in one hand and a confident spark in his gaze Frank hadn't seen in years. They met in the garage, the heart of their project and almost a second home by now. The walls were littered with sketches, code printouts, and scribbled reminders. "Don't wait for permission," Elon's words taped right above the workbench, their guiding star. Ryan pulled out a portable projector and said, "They want us to present a live prototype demo to the California Transit Authority next week." Frank sucked in a breath. State-level officials, real-world application, not just underground echoes. It was huge. Bigger than Bakersfield, bigger than him. But when he looked at Adam's expectant face and then his son's steady calm, he realized, they weren't just building a system. They were building a legacy. That night, all three worked under the yellow garage bulb, tweaking the module to California spec. Heat sensors, tunnel-grade materials, emergency overrides. Marvin stopped by too, bringing fresh parts and the smell of steady hands. Every turn of a wrench, every line of code, rang with weight. Outside, the desert light dimmed, but inside, the air buzzed with quiet energy. They called themselves Project Respira, but now it felt more than a life-breathing valve system. It felt like a lifeline for communities that thought they'd stopped mattering. The morning of the presentation arrived with clear skies and nervous hearts. The California Transit Authority HQ was a sleek building of steel and glass, an impossible contrast to Frank's dusty garage, but stepping inside, he didn't falter. He had vision. He had data. And he had all the reasons they needed him to succeed. Adam began, showing animated traffic models of congested tunnels and how Respira lifted pressure, rerouting flow and reducing bottlenecks. Ryan followed with integration timelines, partnership frameworks, and safety reviews. Frank closed with the story, the diner booth, Mary's garden, the moment he realized aging didn't mean giving up. He repeated Musk's words, grounding them with truth: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. The room was silent. Not awkwardly so. Respectfully. Then they asked questions, hard, technical, necessary questions. Frank answered each, sometimes with data, sometimes with emotion. He talked about Bakersfield's rebirth. He talked about how innovation sometimes comes from quiet places. At the end, the lead commissioner said, "This isn't speculation. It's real. We're approving a regional pilot." Frank's knees nearly buckled. He caught Ryan's eye, pride unspoken but shining. It wasn't just about traffic anymore. It was about showing that someone thought left behind could still lead. Back at home, the garage exploded with laughter. They hugged, stepped on each other's toes, and shared coffee from mismatched mugs. That night, Frank walked to his porch, looked out over the empty street, and realized Bakersfield felt alive again, its heartbeat syncing with Project Respira's. He knew the pilot would bring scrutiny. Some would question his age, his methods, his origin. But he didn't care. For the first time in decades, he felt fertile. Growth. Legacy. He touched his temple and whispered to himself, "We just started digging." And beneath it all, their tunnel waited, ready to carry not just cars, but belief into new territory. Frank Dwyer stood at the podium of the town's new community center, the same dusty halls where he once listened to dismal forecasts for Bakersfield's future. The stage lights felt brutal after the soft yellow glow of the garage, but he held his ground, eyes steady on the rows of familiar faces, neighbors, former colleagues, even the waitress Kayla who now smiled at him like he'd returned from another dimension. This was the day they unveiled Project Respira's pilot and, with it, a glint of renewed hope for a town that was long on quiet and short on promise. Frank cleared his throat and began, his voice carrying decades of quiet longing and hidden strength. "I stood here 20 years ago when the highways bypassed us," he said, pace controlled but resolute. "They said Bakersfield was left behind. That we were past our prime." He held up a blueprint of the transit lung. "They said I was. But today, standing with Respira, backed by a tunnel breathing beneath Las Vegas and now being tested by transit planners statewide, I want you to know, we weren't forgotten. We were just waiting." He paused. A hush rippled through the crowd. He continued, bridging the personal and the communal, "This is about more than traffic. It's about showing that age isn't a sentence. It's about walkers and retirees and dreamers. It's about quiet communities believing again, about small-town America knowing it still matters." He drew a deep breath and repeated Musk's words that had become their rallying cry: "When something is important enough, you do it, even if the odds are not in your favor." An ovation rose, not polite but real, before he even finished. Tears shimmered in unexpected eyes. Later, in a back room with his team, Frank let himself feel the weight of it all, the skepticism, the late-night labors, the collapse, the rebuild. His eyes lingered on Ryan and Adam, and then on the old wooden workbench transformed into a test console. Marvin, stoic as always, gave him a firm nod. Frank saw in them more than collaborators, they were witnesses to resurgence. He let a smile break through. News crews filmed as the transit lung module, mounted on a mock section of tunnel, activated its valves in time-lapse, congestion simulation, pressure building, valves opening, flow corrected. Bakersfield's local television turned it into a brief prime-time segment. A week later, regional transportation planners asked to tour his garage. More letters followed, invites to speak at senior innovation summits, letters from retirees saying, "You made me believe I still have work to do." One even came from Barbara Biskind, late-life inventor at IDEO, telling him she'd told her team, "This is how you design with heart at any age." Frank pinned it above his blueprints. A month after the presentation, the California Transit Authority green-lit the Bakersfield pilot project. Crews installed a small Respira module in a peripheral test segment near a bypass under construction. The metrics were clear: travel times reduced, flow improved. More importantly, the project reinvigorated local investment. Small businesses reopened, new apartments went up, and young professionals started trickling back, drawn not by traffic, but by purpose. Under late afternoon light, Frank walked past the main street where storefronts reopened, where laughter returned. A child, riding his bike, slowed near Frank and asked, "Are you the tunnel guy?" Frank nodded and smiled so deeply it was like the sun returned. Back home, Frank sat in his corner booth at the diner. Kayla brought him coffee. He lifted the cup to his lips before realizing the moment, he wasn't anonymous anymore. Today, he was the man who made a tunnel breathe again, not just beneath Las Vegas, but beneath America's doubts. He thought of Elon's journey, the public failures, the SpaceX rockets that blew up, the personal fortune poured into ventures that many said couldn't succeed, of persistence that turned failure into fuel. He thought of Bakersfield, of forgotten roads transformed, of the power of one idea tunneled upward from quiet hands. And he whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else, "We dug deep, and we rose." The morning arrived too early and too full of possibility, but Frank Dwyer had waited decades for a day like this. The garage, the humble womb of Project Respira, buzzed with a quiet hum under fluorescent lights as the team prepared to depart for Bakersfield's pilot tunneling site. Frank slipped on his hard hat, marked in faded letters with "Prototype Grandpa," and looked at Adam and Ryan, racked with purpose and a shared fire that made him feel decades young again. The air outside was crisp with hope, the sky wide and open above a town that felt newly alive. When they reached the construction yard at the edge of Bakersfield, machinery rumbled. Bulldozers, cranes, the scent of freshly turned earth, it all throbbed with motion, with metamorphosis. The tunnel segment lay ahead, a black yawning mouth in concrete, waiting for their prototype to breathe new life into it. Officials in hard hats and vests hovered nearby, watching them step toward the opening like they carried the future in their hands. Frank's chest tightened. This was it. With careful precision, they wheeled the transit lung module on its trailer to the tunnel's entrance. The walls seemed to listen as Frank adjusted cables, monitored the control tablet, and watched the live feed of sensors lining the passage. Adam and Ryan made final calibrations, posture taut, eyes blazing. Frank breathed deep. This space, underground, was alive with their shared daring, their collective refusal to fade. At the signal, the technician from the Transit Authority flipped the switch. The lights in the tunnel flickered. The sensors came alive. The valves shifted. The screen pulsed with data, flow rates, pressure changes, congestion clearing. For a moment, nothing moved except the numbers. Then came the hum of motion, toy cars tracking a simulation, lights trailing, flow straightening. Then, live testing began. A small EV entered the tunnel, moving forward. It slowed as congestion built, began to creep. Then, Frank held his breath, the transit lung opened a bypass path, and the EV glided through. The raw passage, clay, steel, hum of triggered gears, looked like life streaming through a broken artery, healing itself. Engineers gasped. Cameras clicked. The officials watched, stunned silence giving way to murmurs of awe. The committed senator, who'd come to observe, whispered, "Well, hell." Frank felt tears in his eyes, tears not of relief, but of belonging. They watched test results rise, speed improved by 80%, bottleneck dissolved, emergency reserves reacting. Then all eyes turned to Frank. A train of congratulations heated through him. But he felt grounded. This wasn't about accolades. This was about proving that someone lived who believed deeply, that age didn't diminish contribution, that a town could breathe again. Later, under midday sun, Frank, Adam, and Ryan stood by a mock station built into the tunnel wall. A child from the town, visiting with her father, asked wide-eyed, "Are you the tunnel guy?" Frank nodded and said, "We're the tunnel people." She smiled. After the tests, they queued into the small control hut where Frank whispered, voice drenched in quiet triumph, "We dug." Ryan reached out, squeezed his shoulder. "We're part of something real." And later, when they returned home with sunburned faces and hearts pumping with momentum, the garage seemed smaller and bigger at once, a cradle and a command center. He took off the prototype grandpa hat, hung it above the workbench next to Elon's persistent quote, "When something is important enough, you do it in spite of fear." He reached up, traced the letters. That hat wasn't a joke, it was a declaration. The tunnel was breathing. Bakersfield was breathing. So was he. Frank's hands hovered over the control console, breath caught in his chest as the tunnel test commenced. The equations they'd simulated countless times were now translating into the pulse of real-world data. Glowing streams of live flow diagrams streamed across the screen, colored bands representing traffic density, thick reds giving way to amber, then fading into smooth greens as valves opened, rerouted, adapted. The transit lung module pulsed in sync, a silent heartbeat of mechanics responding to algorithmic commands. Adam, Ryan, and a team of Bakersfield officials watched over his shoulder, their faces lit by screen light and urgency. Frank's guts twisted. This was the moment they'd built toward, the pivot between prototype and paradigm shift. The test wasn't just about clearing congestion. It was validation, for him and for everyone who'd written him off. The first EV, piloted by a test driver, glided into the tunnel, cameras tracking its movement like digital eyes. Bottleneck ahead. Pressure building. Then relay activation. The bypass path opened. Flow resumed. Data spiked, throughput jumped by 85%, delay plummeted by 70%. Engineers cheered quietly, not with loud bells but with held breaths and tears in their eyes. Frank closed his eyes. The tunnel had taken its first real breath. Then came the glitch. A sensor line flickered red, fault detected. Every system demoted into fail-safe mode. The valves began retracting. Panic fluttered at Frank's core. The EV slowed. Adam lunged, fingers dancing across the console to reroute data, bypass protocol. Frank inhaled, steadying himself. "Hold the override," he murmured. The system hesitated, then obeyed. Flow stabilized. Relief washed over him. The glitch had tested not just the system, but their resilience. Officials exhaled as one. Ryan leaned in to whisper, "We did it, Dad." Frank nodded, voice lodged in his throat. By late afternoon, every metric lay before them: flow efficiency, redundancy response, fallback safety margins. Engineers and regional planners crowded around as Frank walked through the narrative. It breathed. It stumbled. We kept it alive. Above their heads, the transit lung winked on as though healing itself. Cameras clicked. Data printed. The senator who'd observed early unscribbled notes, then turned to Frank with renewed warmth. "This changes everything." As they packed up, Frank stepped outside into golden evening light. Bakersfield streets glowed with possibility. A small crowd waved, neighbors, townsfolk, the diner waitress Kayla among them. She clapped and mouthed, "You did it." Frank felt gravity shift under his feet. Back in the garage, old tools gleamed with fresh meaning. He lifted the prototype grandpa hard hat, placed it gently on the bench, and beside it, as if waiting, Elon's line appeared on a sticky note: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That hat wasn't a joke anymore. It was a banner. He traced the letters with worn fingers and whispered, "We did it." And somewhere beneath the dusty light of his origin, the tunnel exhaled again, steady, alive, breathing. Frank stood at the edge of the newly reopened Main Street, heart pounding as he watched the first young family move into one of the refurbished storefront apartments. Children's laughter echoed between freshly painted facades, and the bakery's neon sign buzzed to life for the first time in years. This street, once silent and empty, now pulsed with possibility, and Frank felt the hum directly in his bones. Just months before, the world thought Bakersfield was done, that it belonged to memory. But here they were, new entrepreneurs setting up tables under canvas awnings, couples pushing strollers filled with groceries, neighbors lingering on porches with cups of coffee in hand. It was as if the town had inhaled hope. He took a deep breath and walked slowly down the sidewalk, every footstep a beat in the renewed rhythm of his hometown. When he passed the once empty diner, he saw Kayla teaching another young waitress how to pour latte art. She looked up and smiled at him, and he nodded, "It's back." She reached over and clinked their cups quietly. Even Dottie, who had moved to Fresno, texted a photo, a small garden she'd planted on her new porch, captioned with a single word: "Inspired." It was as if the entire town, even the ones who had left, felt the change. That evening, the garage glowed with soft light, its walls lined with blueprints, LEDs, and the transit lung module humming quietly on the bench. Frank and his makeshift team, Adam, Ryan, and Marvin, celebrated without champagne. Instead, they drank coffee from mismatched mugs, leaning against the workbench, laughing softly about glitches fixed and surprises won. Ryan said, "We didn't just dig a tunnel. We dug the town out." Marvin cracked a rare grin, "We only meant to fix traffic. Didn't know we'd save souls." In that curving light, Frank realized that what they built wasn't just a system of valves. It was a lifeline. The next morning, community members gathered at the old library now repurposed as a community hub. Frank walked through desks where adults signed up for evening classes, teenagers coded on laptops, seniors practiced yoga in a sunlit corner. He realized Project Respira had become more than pits and planning, it had become the spark for community revival, the revival of relevance and connection. A former high school teacher, now volunteering in a reuse program for engineering students, waved him over. "You gave our kids something to believe in," she said quietly. "Not stories, real evidence that we matter." Frank swallowed and smiled, remembering how he used to sit in this building, listening to doom piled upon complacency. He wondered how long he could keep holding back tears. Back in the garage that night, he flipped through his old notepad, the one with the toothpick bridge sketch and the original transit lung diagram. He looked at each line, each scribble, and recognized that this project had roots in weightier soil than traffic analysis. It was about building anew, about breathing life into quiet dreams. He taped a new note to the wall beneath Elon's quote, "When something is important enough," the one he discovered about doing it even if the odds are not in your favor. He added, "Priority, breathe life." The workshop felt less like a lab and more like a heart. That weekend, a small crowd gathered for a public presentation in a tent in the main square. Frank stepped forward with Adam and Ryan at his side. He spoke about engineering and hope, not as separate things, but as echoing in one another. He spoke about aging, about being written off, and how sometimes the smallest gear makes the biggest turn. He quoted Musk. Not to elevate himself, but to lean into that daring that had lit the spark. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. A hush settled. Then applause, raw, sustained, communal. Later, as twilight painted the sky with orange glow, the town looked different, alive. Frank walked home slowly, footsteps echoing on the street that had come back from emptiness. He passed the bakery, now brightly lit with loaves he could smell from outside. He passed the laundromat, filled with chatter and coins. He passed the schoolhouse, where volunteers fixed computers so kids could learn digital design. Everywhere, life was pulsing through. Back at home, Frank sat quietly in the diner booth where he once stared into cold coffee. Now the cup was warm, half-finished, beside a framed photo, him, wearing his hard hat, standing in the newly completed pilot tunnel. He raised his cup to the photo, whispered, "We did it." And in his chest, a quiet engine revved. This wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something bigger. He was not too old. The tunnel had brought him, and them, back to life, and the breath of the town whispered, "The road continues." Frank Dwyer stood at the front of the Grand Auditorium in Sacramento, heart pounding but voice steady, the spotlight illuminating the quiet lines of age and determination in his face. Green energy banners and bustling officials surrounded him, yet all he saw was an auditorium filled with faces, engineers, policymakers, reporters, waiting to judge. He took a breath and remembered Mary, the diner booth where it began, the garage lit by a single bulb, the tunnel that dared to breathe. He cleared his throat, and began. "I used to be invisible," he said, voice soft but rising. "Retired, forgotten, like many of you might feel. A man from a small town, told the ideas he had were too old-fashioned to matter. That maybe he should just settle." He paused. "But then I heard something from someone I barely knew. Elon Musk. He said, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. And I wondered, what if that's true?" He watched murmurs ripple through the room. Eyes softened. He leaned in. "I built something in my garage that was called crazy. I nearly died for it, in more ways than one. And today, we've run it underground in Las Vegas, in Bakersfield, and now these partnerships are scaling. This isn't about me. It's about showing that being advanced in age doesn't mean you're behind. It means you've gone farther. And still, if you're willing, you can go deeper." He saw phones lift, eyes glisten, and even the most cynical among them leaned closer. He quoted Musk again. This time his other words that reflected fear turned fuel. "There are times when something is important enough, you believe in it enough, that you do it in spite of fear." He let it hang. Then he said, "I felt fear. A lot of fear. But I also felt something stronger, purpose. And I know that purpose isn't just for the young. It's for anyone whose heart still beats." Applause erupted, not polite, but deeply moved. Officials stood. Reporters leaned forward. And Frank realized something. this wasn't the end of the tunnel. It was the opening. He walked off stage to handshakes and embraces, and saw Ryan grinning like he'd discovered a new dad in front of the world. Adam shook his head in wonder. Later, outside, a young engineer approached him. "Sir, your words, they changed everything." Frank looked at her steady young face and said, "Nothing was changed until someone believed it could start again." He walked away into the autumn air, chest full, knowing that the room they changed carried the promise of change itself. Roads reopened, dreams revived, a legacy delivered by hands grown old but never worn out. Frank Dwyer stood in a softly lit garage, now clean, organized, and humming with new possibility. The transit lung prototype sat in the center on its crafted pedestal, a mix of old tools and new tech, LEDs tracing the embedded sensors like constellations, a silent witness to everything that had happened. Around him, the walls held not just blueprints and schematics, but photos, snapshots of reclaimed storefronts, families laughing on Main Street, mail messages from retired dreamers reignited, Ryan's smile when he called, Mary's overpass model resting on his workbench like a talisman of memory and ambition. He walked to it, his hands trembling slightly, and picked up the toothpick bridge model, faded but intact. It looked small against the polished prototype, yet both spoke the same language, building something that matters. Frank ran his fingers along the bridge's minuscule trusses, then placed it next to the transit lung. It was an unspoken arc of time, from wood and glue, from child's curiosity, to valves and code made to save cities. He turned back to the garage's fluorescent light and whispered, "We built something bigger than traffic." His voice carried the weight of decades unspoken, and the quiet roar of purpose rediscovered. Behind him, Ryan entered, coffee in hand. "That bridge still holds." Frank nodded. "Some things don't rust." They stood together in collected calm. Adam followed, his laptop open, ready. "We're scheduled for a World Summit next month. They want you, Dad, not as the prototype guy, but as the founder of a movement." Frank looked into the warm light of the prototype, then at his team. "Okay," he said. "Let's build the next chapter." The night hummed with plans, sketches, next steps. This wasn't the ending, it was the prelude. Weeks later, at the Global Transit Innovation Summit, Frank took the stage again. The hall was packed with the brightest and the boldest, world transport leaders, architects, futurists. Behind him, the image of Bakersfield's Main Street glowed, a street reborn, not just paved. Frank spoke of a tunnel that breathed, but more, a town that remembered itself. He spoke of aging gracefully into purpose, of dreaming again not as a flash of youth, but as a fire fed by experience. He said, "The tunnel is just the beginning. What we dug underneath our town, our hearts, our assumptions, something that never ends." He saw tears in the crowd. He saw nods of recognition. He saw plans forming in their minds. And he thought, this is why we dig. Back at home, the world kept breathing. Project Respira moves into pipeline collaborations, shared designs for cities from Phoenix to Portland. Frank hears updates from engineers referencing his code. He hears from retirees asking how they can join the movement. Bakersfield celebrates continued growth, an incubator for elder-led tech initiatives, a mentorship program between students and the tunnel team. Everywhere, the breath continues. One evening, Frank visits the diner. It's quieter than the summit, but just as meaningful. Kayla brings coffee and sets it beside him. He opens his palm, reveals a set of tiny wooden truss pieces for another miniature bridge, flash of inspiration. "Want to help build another one?" he asks her quietly. She grins. "Let's build something." He smiles, eyes dimmed by the glow of living. Before going home, he steps outside under a sky heavy with stars, an arch of permanence. He removes the worn hat from the peg above the workbench. The prototype grandpa hat, and places it beside Mary's bridge. He lets the night air catch it, as if the world itself read his years and said thank you. He breathes deeply. Life is amplification. The tunnel was only the start. Aging had become a bridge, not a barrier. He was never the end of his story, just the beginning of something greater. And with every breath, they keep building. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?